The land wore the final days of autumn like a scab that refused to heal, brittle and aching under a sky the color of lead. Western Wyoming had turned harsh, stripped bare of its summer ease. Wind cut like glass across the open plains, cold and sharp with the taste of snow not yet fallen, but already hanging thick in the breath of the land. Trees stood naked, their bark gray and weathered, skeletal limbs rattling in the wind like bones remembering warmth. The last leaves had been torn loose days ago, scattered like forgotten prayers. Beneath the heavy sky, the wide Platte River slithered sluggish and sullen, swollen with last night's storm, its surface broken by currents that muttered over debris dragged from upstream. Mud lined its banks, dark and soft, holding the weight of anything foolish enough to tread near. Hank Bell rode his north fence line beneath that brooding sky, rein slack in one gloved hand, rifle lashed behind the saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon with the grim patience of a man who had come to expect nothing good. His boots were thick with dried muck, spattered from the night's rain. He rode without sound, his breath curling from his mouth in pale steam, his horse's steps muffled against the damp earth. Hank was a man whose shape told of past fights, shoulders still wide, back straight, but whose manner bore no urgency. There was wear to his features, like stones shaped by years of weather. Creases like fault lines around his mouth, eyes the bleach hue of overcast dawn, unreadable and distant. He didn't speak. There was no one to speak to, not for miles, and not for years. Then came the sound, slight, almost imagined, carried on the wind, thin and fragile as spun glass. A human sound, a whimper, barely louder than the river against rock, but unmistakably real. Hank's shoulders went rigid. He halted the horse, listening. Silence again, then the sound returned, broken, breathless, pain and fear wrapped in a single thread of voice. He dismounted quickly, boots squelching into the wet soil, hand already near the rifle as he moved toward the water's edge. The river bank dipped away around a bend where the current ran slower, muddied by silt, choked with rain-fed turbulence. There, tangled in a snag of river grass and driftwood, lay a body, a girl, half submerged, limbs limp and awkward, black hair clinging to her face, skin ghost-pale and lips stained with blue. Her dress was in tatters, sleeves ripped down to the shoulder, soaked through and clinging to her frame. One arm drifted oddly, twisted, the skin torn open at the shoulder, where blood coiled in fine red strands into the current. Hank didn't hesitate. He plunged into the water, breath hissing at the bite of cold that struck through denim and leather. It took seconds to reach her. His arms went beneath hers, and with a hard pull, he hauled her out onto the bank. Her body convulsed once violently, and a choked cough tore from her chest. Water spilled from her mouth, followed by a ragged breath and a pained groan. She curled slightly, then fell still again, too weak to move. He saw immediately she was Lakota, northern, by the shape of her face, the fine arch of her brow, the soft slope of her jaw. Too young to be that bruised. Her face was marked, not just with dirt, but with time lived hard. In her clenched fist she held something, a bundle of leather, bound with sinew and feather, sacred, not meant to be taken. Hank didn't touch it. He didn't ask where she'd come from or why she was 30 miles from the nearest reservation. Half dead in the cold. He just peeled off his coat, wrapped it around her, lifted her into the saddle like she weighed nothing at all, and climbed up behind her. The horse snorted, restless under the added weight and scent of blood, but Hank's voice was low, steady, calming. He turned them toward the cabin and rode hard, pushing the animal faster than it liked, knowing every minute mattered when cold ran through blood and bones like poison. Her head lolled against his chest, breath coming thin and shallow. Once she trembled, then even that left her. The ride felt longer than it was, every hoofbeat a clock ticking down. When the cabin came into view, tucked against a crooked line of wind-bent pines, its chimney dark, its porch rimed with frost, Hank's jaw clenched. He kicked the door open with one boot, stepped inside, and laid her near the hearth. The place was cold, but dry. He worked quickly, stripping her boots and seeing the raw, blistered trail of torn skin up her heel, the early frostbite crawling her toes. She'd walked far before the river caught her. He cut her sleeve and found the wound reopened, leaking and raw. No time to ask how it happened. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey, poured it clean, didn't flinch when her body jerked with pain. He bound it tight with torn strips from an old shirt, checked her breathing, then set a pot of water to boil. When steam curled, he lifted her head gently, coaxed water past her lips, watching her throat work as she swallowed in slow, painful motions. Then he buried her under every hide, every blanket, every scrap of warmth he had. He fed the fire until the stones behind it glowed, throwing off dry heat, the only thing between her and death. She didn't wake fully, but her breath deepened, her body stopped shaking. He crouched beside her, elbows on his knees, studying her face. Young, Lakota, not local. The bruises didn't belong to someone who had simply fallen. There was history there, carved quiet and cruel into her skin. But what struck him most was her silence. Not just unconsciousness, but the way her entire body carried it. As if she had forgotten how to speak long before the river stole her voice. In her hand, still, the charm bundle remained, waterlogged, feathers clumped and leather darkened, but intact. A piece of something sacred. A prayer, maybe, or a warning. Hank didn't know. He only looked at it, then at her, then finally whispered into the firelight, voice gravel thick, meant more for Ghost than the girl herself. Don't die on me. I've buried enough already. Morning came pale and reluctant. The sun never broke through clean, only filtered weakly through the ash-gray clouds, as if exhausted by the effort. The fire had burned low, but warmth still lingered. Outside, the world remained brittle and still, holding its breath beneath the weight of everything that hadn't yet happened. Hank stirred the cooling embers with the calm efficiency of a man long practiced in solitude, coaxing life back into the fire with careful handfuls of kindling. Flames caught with a quiet hunger, casting a golden pulse through the small cabin. He turned then, his eyes resting on the girl still cocooned beneath every hide he owned. She hadn't shifted much through the night, but her breath no longer rasped, and the pallor of her skin had faded. No longer the bloodless blue of near death. By mid-morning, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, slow and steady, with none of the panic one might expect. Only the quiet readiness of someone used to waking in unfamiliar places. Her gaze swept the room in a single, assessing pass before it settled on Hank. She said nothing. He hadn't expected her to. "You're safe here," he said simply, voice low and steady like the fire behind him. She didn't answer. He stepped back to let her absorb her surroundings, a cabin hewn from rough pine logs, its interior worn by time and silence. A single room held everything, wood stove, table, cot, and the scent of smoke soaked into every board. On the mantel above the cold hearth sat a tin-framed photograph of a boy, maybe 10, with wild hair and a crooked grin, and beneath it a wooden urn hand-carved and smoothed by years of touch. She looked at it. He noticed a flicker in her eyes, the faint tilt of her head. She recognized loss when she saw it, but still asked nothing. Hank busied himself, filling a battered tin pot with water and oats, setting it over flames. As it cooked, he added a pinch of salt and a crumbling scrap of dried apple. The scent of something warm and real slowly replaced the cold. When it thickened, he ladled it into a bowl and placed it near her on the floor. No spoon, just a folded cloth to cradle it. She accepted it wordlessly. Later, when she tried to move, pain seized her and she winced. Hank returned to her side, unhurried, carrying a bundle of boiled rags, a spool of thread, and a needle. Her wound needed stitching. At the sight of the needle, her shoulders tensed, but still she did not speak. He knelt beside her, his hands callous but deliberate, the hands of someone who had failed before and was determined not to again. She flinched once. He paused, eyes flicking to hers, then continued. When he finished, he cleaned the sweat from her brow with another warm cloth. That night, she sat up on her own for the first time. Her face was pale and hollow, her long hair tangled across her shoulders, but there was strength in her spine, unspoken, undeniable. Across the fire, Hank carved something from a piece of pine, his hands moving slowly, rhythmically, like the motion itself kept time. She watched him. Beneath the hides, her fingers moved reflexively to her throat, searching for something absent. The leather cord she once wore was snapped. The charm, feathers, beads, and a carved silver bone lay crumpled near the cot. One feather was torn, its shaft splintered. She looked down at it, and for a moment her lips parted, as if a curse or prayer nearly escaped. Hank noticed. Without speaking, he picked it up, carried it to the small drawer by the stove, and retrieved a needle and sinew. With the same careful steadiness he'd used on her shoulder, he mended the charm, tied the knots, reinforced the bent feather. Then, rising slowly, he crossed to the window, lifted a rusted nail hammered into the frame, and hung it there, where the draft from the cracks in the logs might make it sway. She followed every movement with her eyes. When he turned back, she wasn't looking at him. She was watching the charm twist in the firelight, the feathers fluttering like smoke. Her gaze shimmered, not with tears, but with something heavier, older, not gratitude, recognition. She did not say, "Thank you." He didn't expect her to. Outside, the wind shifted from west to north, a biting wind, the kind that comes before a freeze. Hank added another log to the fire and settled into the chair across from her. Neither spoke, but when the wind rose and howled against the chinked walls, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something being carried away. Dawn broke sharp as a knife edge, slicing across the horizon with sudden winter light. The cold bit deep, stinging and silent. Hank stepped out onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, breath fogging in the pale morning. He scanned the treeline as he always did. But this time he froze. Not a few, but hundreds. They formed a sweeping arc across the clearing, etched into frost-kissed earth like a warning. His boots creaked on the frozen boards as he stepped down, his body tense with quiet dread. At the rise where the land sloped into field, he stopped. And that's when he saw them. Across the distant ridge, the Lakota appeared, row after row of mounted warriors stretched like a wave frozen in the moment before it breaks. They didn't move, didn't shout, didn't raise their weapons. They didn't need to. Their stillness was a kind of pressure, as heavy as it was silent, a wall of presence and purpose and judgment that hung in the cold like breath that never faded. Horses stood as rigid as the men on their backs, exhaling clouds into the frigid morning air. There were at least 300, maybe more. Hank didn't flinch. He'd seen his share of chaos, stampeding cattle that crushed bone and breath, barns swallowed in flame, the empty gaze of dying men on muddy battlefields. But the stillness was different. It was not peace. It was a moment before lightning tears the sky, before the ground shakes. It was consequence waiting for breath. One rider broke from the formation. He came forward at a slow, deliberate pace, his horse slicing through the silence without resistance. The others did not shift or follow. His face was painted with dark lines, trailing like the ghosts of ash down his cheeks. The stallion beneath him was lean and black, its eyes wild but obedient. Closer now. Hank could make out the long braid tied with feathers, the necklace of carved bone lying still against his chest. The man rode tall, not with effort, but with inheritance, with identity. 20 paces from the porch, he stopped. The breath of his horse rose between them like smoke from a just-lit fire. Then in crisp, unwavering Lakota, he said, "She is not yours. Return her, or your blood will feed the ground." Hank didn't speak. He didn't have to. He understood enough. The man's voice held no rage, no fire, only certainty, as if the world itself had already decided the outcome, and he was merely giving Hank a chance to catch up. After a long pause, Hank turned and walked slowly back into cabin. Sahal was already standing near the fire, wrapped in layers of hide. She had heard them, likely long before he had. Maybe she'd known they would come. Her eyes met his as he entered, and her face did not change. No panic, no surprise, just a weary knowing of someone who had outrun shadows long enough to understand that all roads eventually circle back. "If I go back, I burn," she said simply. Her voice held no plea, just fact. "If I stay, you die." Hank studied her, not as a fugitive, not as something to protect, but as a human being shaped by survival, sharpened by loss. She had already chosen once. He saw that, and so had he. He walked to the table and set down his coffee mug. His hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the wall. Fingers curled around the stock, then paused. hovering there, the way a man hesitates before opening a door he can't close. Slowly, he let it go. They won't listen to words, he said. Only action. Sahal nodded, jaw clenched, not from fear but from resolve. My father traded me to a man who sees me as something to own. If I return, I am not a daughter, not a wife. I am currency. That is not life. That is fire that doesn't kill you, just burns you slow. Hank's voice was quiet, steady. Then we don't give you back. Outside, the wind gusted harder, sending a scatter of dry leaves across the porch like startled birds. The shadows of the Lakota horses stretched long over the grass, still and cold. The lone warrior had not moved. Hank stepped to the window and looked out, jaw tight. They won't come at night, he murmured. But when dawn breaks, they might not need to. He turned to her again. Do you want to run? Sahal shook her head once. If we run, they chase harder, and you die tired. He exhaled, slowly. Then we stay. The light faded behind the hills, and silence filled the room. Not the silence of strangers anymore, but of two people who had run out of things to offer and decided to stand their ground. The fire cracked. The cabin groaned. Outside, the Lakota waited, wrapped in dusk and inevitability. Inside, the two of them began to prepare, not like warriors, but like people who knew the value of quiet defiance. The night descended like ash, soft and smothering. No wind, no stars, just the hush of snow, holding its breath above the ground. The fire burned low. Shadows flickered across the log walls, stretching long over the still forms within. Hank sat in his chair with the rifle across his lap. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even cautious. Just ready. His eyes never left the door. Every creak, every sigh from the timbers made his muscles tense. He didn't need to look out the window to know they were still out there. He could feel them, waiting, behind him. Sahal moved with quiet precision. She took the stained cloth that once lay across the table, marked with blood, soot, and memory, and folded it with care, pressing its edges as if trying to smooth time itself. Then she knelt near the hearth and scrubbed the floor, working at a dark patch of dried blood nearly invisible to the eye, but vivid in memory. Not since dusk. But it wasn't the silence of unfamiliarity anymore. It was a silence of things unspoken, too real for language. Grief, survival, regret. They shared a room, a fire, and a past neither had asked for. They came through the barn, he said, eyes on the fire. The words sounded like they'd been carried in his chest for years, rubbed raw by the distance. It was late. I was out in the pasture, chasing a steer that broke the fence. He swallowed hard, his throat raw with memory. I got back just in time to see the roof collapse, he murmured, voice low, gravel thick. Smoke was pouring out everywhere. Couldn't breathe, didn't matter. I ran straight in anyway. His eyes flickered, not to her, but towards something far off, something only he could see. I screamed their names over and over. No answer. Nothing but fire and silence. Sahal didn't speak. Her hand, halfway through folding the cloth, paused mid-motion, fingers pressed into the worn fabric as if it might anchor her. I begged them, Hank said, dropped my rifle in the snow, fell on my knees and begged, told them there was nothing left to burn, nothing left to take. His voice cracked at the edges. He finally turned his face toward her, not a full glance, not quite direct, but close enough. They laughed, he said, a bitter line curling at his mouth. Turned their backs and let it all burn. The fire between them snapped softly, its crackle a cruel mimic of that memory. Sahal placed the cloth down with slow deliberation. I am not a wound, she said quietly, eyes never leaving the flame. But I know what one feels like. The words didn't seek comfort. They came out with the weight of a truth long held in silence, needing neither response nor permission to exist. Hank blinked, not in surprise, but in something older, recognition. She rose and crossed the hearth. From the small pouch at her side, she drew a pinch of dried pine needles, dropped them into the fire. The scent bloomed, sharp and resinous, winding upward into the rafters like a memory turned to smoke. They call me traitor, she said, voice even, gaze still on the fire. Because I said no. Because I refused to be sold like cattle. Because I ran. She knelt, hands spread toward the warmth. I wasn't supposed to make it to the river, she added, or survive the man who tried to catch me before I reached it. He thought killing me would wipe his shame clean, but he missed. Her fingers brushed her side, where Hank's bandage still held firm. Now they wait, she said, expecting me to walk back into their fire and pretend it's honor. At last she turned to him. Her face, half lit by the fire, was neither soft nor hard, only real. They don't know what honor is. Hank met her gaze without flinching. Maybe no one does anymore. They held the moment between them, not in agreement, but in something deeper. A shared truth, not forgiveness. Not yet, just knowing. She gave a small nod, then rose and moved past him. The folded cloth made a soft sound as she set it on the table. He didn't follow her with his eyes. She sat across from him, wrapped herself in the fur, and stared into the flame. The room quieted, not into emptiness, but into presence. Outside, the wind murmured through the trees. Somewhere beyond, unseen but certain, the Lakota warriors held their circle still. The next day came without violence, but not without weight. The sun never rose high, dragging low across the sky like a tired promise. Long shadows stretched across the snow-covered field. Though the warriors stayed out of sight, Hank could feel them, like pressure behind a sealed door, silent but enough to warp the frame. Inside, he mended Tack's broken stirrup by the hearth, while Sahal sorted dried leaves and roots from her pouch. The silence had shifted, no longer filled with caution or the strain of unfamiliarity. It was something more settled, lived in, a silence with room for breath. As twilight deepened, Hank set his work aside, leather folded, hands rough and still. He sat across from her, firelight rising and falling in quiet rhythm. When he spoke, it was without hesitation. "If I took you out of here," he said, voice low, deliberate, "went west toward the Snake River, would they follow?" Sahal's hand stilled. She lifted her eyes and looked straight at him. "They would think you stole me," she said. "They would not ask questions. They would not listen. You'd be dead before sunrise. Anyone who gave you shelter after would follow." Hank nodded, slow, unsurprised, as if her answer confirmed what he already knew. A dry smile tugged at his lips. "I used to think I wasn't afraid of dying," he said. "But lately, I catch myself regretting how little I've lived." Sahal didn't smile, but something in her gaze Jen told. "That is not weakness," she said. "It is remembering." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the shifting orange glow. "I buried a family once," he said. "Put them in the ground with my own hands. Didn't feel anything. Thought that made me strong." His voice softened. "Then you come stumbling out of that river, half dead, silent as stone, and for the first time in a long while, I wanted to keep something alive again." Sahal reached toward the fire, palms stretched wide, as if reaching for the flame itself. Then slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hand beside his on the wooden floor. Not touching, just close, close enough for warmth to pass between them. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I know you didn't cause my pain." She paused, watching the fire. "I may still die because of what I chose." Her hand moved, inches closer. "But I am not a promise," she said. "And I'm not asking for one," Hank replied. Their fingers met, barely, just enough to share heat. Not held, not laced, just a point of contact, brief and real, like two stars brushing in the night before parting again. The fire crackled. Sparks rose. Neither spoke. They stayed like that, two people sharing silence, sharing breath, sharing one truth, that the world might never forgive, but still they endured. Finally, Hank whispered, voice like wind scraping rock, "You don't belong to me, but I'll die before I let them treat you like something to trade." Sahal didn't answer, but her hand stayed right there against his. Outside, the wind moved low through the branches. The trees groaned. The snow shifted. And the warriors, unseen, unmoving, held their circle like a noose. Inside, by firelight, Two people sat close in the world aloud, not preparing for escape, but for the price of staying. The third morning came hard, without warning or mercy. No mist, no softness, only a white steel light that poured over the frozen plains. The stillness outside was unnatural, more than quiet. It was the hush of something coiled, waiting. Hank stepped to the window. They had moved. Sometime in the night, the Lakota had closed the distance. Their line now rested just beyond the field's edge, horses shuffling beneath warriors who sat like carved stone. Bows were drawn, arrows notched. No sound came. In the center, one rider stood taller. Paint marked his face. Vivid red slashed across his cheeks like war-made flesh. Hank took one breath. Then he stepped outside, no coat, no weapon, only the worn shirt on his back, and the slow crunch of boots across frost. His hands stayed loose, open at his sides. No fear in his gait, no plea in his eyes. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Sahal followed, her hair braided. A strip of cloth cinched at her waist like a sash of intent. She stepped onto the porch, and together they faced a storm not yet begun.